Imagine 60 million people huddled around black and white television sets, watching a man they loved raise his fist and shout the same joke he'd shouted 100 times before. Only this time, nobody laughed. This time, the studio audience sat frozen, unsure if they had just watched a punchline or witnessed something they were never supposed to see. What happened in that half-second of dead air would haunt one of the most beloved shows in television history, and some say it's the real reason America's favorite bus driver vanished from the screen. This is the story of Ralph Kramden, Jackie Gleason, and the night live television nearly broke. Long before he was shouting to the moon into a television camera, Jackie Gleason was just a kid trying to survive Brooklyn. He was born in 1916 in a working-class corner of the borough, in a home where money never stretched quite far enough and where his father's disappearance, when Gleason was still a boy, left his mother to raise him alone on whatever wages she could scrape together. That kind of childhood doesn't just shape a person's outlook. It becomes the raw material of everything they create afterward. Every ounce of frustration, every flash of stubborn pride, every desperate scheme to get ahead that Ralph Kramden would later act out on television had already been lived, in miniature, by the boy who grew up watching his mother count coins on a kitchen table. Gleason didn't have a tidy path into show business. He ran with pool hall crowds, worked odd jobs, and learned to read a room the way only someone who grew up broke can. Brooklyn itself became his education. The noise of neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls, the exaggerated bravado of men trying to look bigger than their circumstances, the fierce, loving arguments between husbands and wives who couldn't afford a night out but somehow still found something to laugh about. Gleason absorbed all of it. Years later, when he stood on a soundstage and screamed as Ralph Kramden, audiences weren't watching a performance so much as a memory brought back to life. His real break came not in film but on the small stage of live variety television, where his instincts for timing and improvisation made him impossible to ignore. By the early 1950s, Gleason had landed his own program on the Dumont Network, a scrappy showcase called Cavalcade of Stars. It was here, tucked between musical numbers and comedy sketches, that a new character first stumbled onto the screen in 1951, a loud, impatient, endlessly scheming bus driver named Ralph Kramden. He wasn't polished. He wasn't likable in the conventional sense. He was crude, quick to anger, and always chasing a get-rich-quick idea that was destined to collapse, and audiences couldn't get enough of him. At a time when television was still finding its footing, most households tuned in expecting warm, orderly family stories. What they got instead, in these early Honeymooners sketches, was something rawer, a cramped apartment, a couple who yelled at each other the way real couples sometimes do, and a man whose dreams were always just a little too big for his wallet. It was electric precisely because it refused to be tidy. No version of Ralph Kramden works without someone strong enough to stand across the kitchen table from him, and finding that person turned out to be far more complicated than anyone expected. The character of Alice Kramden needed a very specific kind of actress, someone who could hold her own against Gleason's booming energy without ever disappearing into the background, but who also couldn't overpower the comedy with pure aggression. It was a narrow tightrope, and the first woman to walk it was Pert Kelton. Kelton brought a biting, street-smart energy to Alice in those early Cavalcade of Stars sketches. She had the kind of sharp, weary humor that suggested she'd heard every one of Ralph's excuses before and wasn't remotely impressed by any of them. Then, without much explanation, Kelton was gone. The public was told it was a matter of health. In truth, the entertainment industry of the early 1950s was gripped by an anti-communist panic that swept through Hollywood and New York broadcasting alike. Performers, writers, and even people merely associated with someone under suspicion could find themselves blacklisted overnight, often without formal charges or any real evidence. Just enough rumor to make a nervous network unwilling to take the risk. Kelton's name had become entangled in that atmosphere of suspicion, and rather than fight publicly on her behalf, the network simply moved on, quietly and without fanfare. Recasting Alice was no small task. The show needed someone who could be tender without being weak and tough without being shrill, a woman who could deliver a devastating line and still make it clear, underneath it all, that she loved the fool sitting across from her. Audrey Meadows walked into her audition looking every bit the Hollywood beauty CBS executives assumed she was, and they nearly passed on her for exactly that reason. They didn't think a glamorous young actress could believably play a Brooklyn housewife stretching a bus driver's paycheck. Meadows, unwilling to lose the role over an assumption, had new photographs taken of herself with no makeup, plain clothes, and her hair pulled back. Deliberately unglamorous, deliberately real. When Glisson saw them, he knew immediately she understood exactly who Alice was supposed to be. What Meadows brought to the role was different from Kelton's fire, but no less effective. Her Alice was calmer, more measured, letting Ralph's temper ban itself out before delivering a line that could stop him cold. That contrast, his volcanic energy against her steady, cutting patience, became the emotional engine of the show. Audiences didn't just see two people bickering. They saw a marriage, flawed and loud and occasionally exhausting, but unmistakably real. When the Honeymooners broke off into its own standalone series in 1955, it entered a television landscape built almost entirely on comfort. The dominant sitcoms of the era offered spotless living rooms, wise fathers with gentle advice, and children whose biggest problem was usually solved with a hug by the 22-minute mark. It was reassuring, orderly programming designed to soothe rather than provoke. Glisson had no interest in soothing anyone. His Brooklyn apartment set had peeling wallpaper and furniture that looked genuinely worn, not stylized for effect. There were no children delivering cute moral lessons, just two adults locked in a constant, believable tension between the life they had and the one they kept imagining just out of reach. Ralph wasn't a wise patriarch. He was a short-tempered dreamer whose schemes almost always blew up in his own face. Alice wasn't a passive homemaker. She gave as good as she got, every single week. The show's structure only sharpened that honesty. Each episode stood entirely on its own, a complete emotional arc contained within 30 minutes, meaning any viewer could tune in for the first time and immediately understand exactly what was at stake. Out of that format came some of the most quoted lines in American television history. Bang, zoom, straight to the moon, and baby, you're the greatest became phrases repeated in living rooms and workplaces across the country, shorthand for a very particular kind of loud, loving, working-class marriage that hadn't really been shown on television before. Much of that electricity came from how the show was made. Glisson treated every episode like a one-act stage play, performed live, with almost no safety net. There was no laugh track sweetening the jokes. The audience laughter was real, because the tension was real, because at any moment, a line could land wrong, an actor could stumble, and millions of people would see it happen in real time. That unpredictability is part of what made the show feel dangerous in the best possible sense. It's also, some have argued, part of what made it dangerous in the worst sense. Because live television offers no second takes and no way to soften something once it's already out. By the fall of 1956, the Honeymooners had become appointment viewing. In the episode, the deciding vote seemed, on paper, like standard territory for the show. Ralph convinced that his single vote could swing a local election, spiraling into the usual mix of misplaced confidence and self-inflicted humiliation. The premise was familiar. The audience was primed and ready to laugh. For most of the broadcast, the episode delivered exactly what viewers expected. Glisson was in total command of the room, riffing off the energy of the live studio audience the way only he could. But according to those who were there that night, something shifted during a heated exchange between Ralph and Alice. When Glisson delivered his signature threat, the bang, zoom line the audience had heard dozens of times as a harmless running joke, it didn't land the way it always had. His tone had dropped. The rhythm was off. What had always read as cartoonish bluster suddenly, for just a moment, felt like something else entirely. The laugh that was supposed to follow never fully arrived. Crew members who worked the show later described an unfamiliar stillness settling over the studio, the kind of silence that live television almost never produces on purpose. It passed quickly. The scene moved on. The episode finished. The credits rolled. But for those few seconds, the character of Ralph Cramden stopped being a lovable blowhard and became, if only fleetingly, someone the audience wasn't sure they were supposed to be laughing at anymore. It's worth being honest about how much of this moment has become legend rather than documented fact. There's no surviving broadcast footage that isolates that instant the way modern viral clips would. An account of exactly what happened and how the network reacted vary depending on who's telling the story decades later. What's clear is that the discomfort, real or embellished in the retelling, became part of the show's mythology, a single unscripted beat that came to symbolize just how close the show's realism sometimes walked to something uncomfortable. Whether or not that single night was the tipping point, the network's discomfort with the show's tone wasn't imaginary. Sponsors have been increasingly vocal about the rougher edges of the program. The shouting, the domestic tension, the sense that Ralph's anger occasionally felt like it belonged to a real household rather than a sitcom set. Live broadcasting made every one of these moments harder to control. There was no editing room to soften a line reading, no way to trim a scene that landed differently than intended. Audrey Meadows had reportedly voiced her own unease at times about how far Ralph's on-screen tempo was allowed to go, not because she doubted Glisson as a performer, but because she understood how quickly an audience's goodwill could curdle if a joke stopped feeling like a joke. That instinct, whether tied directly to the deciding vote or simply to the accumulated tension of performing live television every week, reflected a genuine anxiety running through the production. None of this played out in public. There was no press conference, no scandal splashed across newspapers, no formal acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. Instead, the pressure moved through private meetings, network executives, nervous sponsors, and a production team increasingly aware that live, unscripted television carried risks that a rehearsed, filmed sitcom simply didn't. What audiences eventually noticed wasn't a dramatic finale but an absence. There was no farewell episode, no on-air acknowledgement that the show they'd been watching every week was coming to a close. The original run, 39 episodes, later nicknamed the Classic 39, simply stopped, and viewers were left to piece together why on their own. The full truth was less a single scandal and more an accumulation of very ordinary pressures. Live television was brutally demanding to produce week after week, with no retakes and no room for error. And Glisson himself was reportedly wearing down under that grind, on top of a personal lifestyle that wasn't exactly built for sustainability. Ratings, while still strong, had begun to soften slightly. And in an industry where advertisers hate uncertainty, even a small dip combined with growing sponsor unease about the show's tone was enough to shift momentum. Rather than push through another exhausting season under those conditions, Glisson chose to step back from the weekly grind and fold Ralph, Alice, and Ed Norton into sketches on his variety program instead, a format that gave him more control and considerably less weekly strain. For Glisson, walking away from the character wasn't a simple business decision. Ralph Cramden had been built, quite literally, out of Glisson's own upbringing. The anger, the ambition, the constant sense of dreaming bigger than his circumstances allowed. Losing the weekly show meant losing the platform where that character had lived most fully, and those close to him said he took the end of the Classic 39 personally, even as he remained determined not to let Ralph disappear for good. In an unusually savvy move for a performer of that era, Glisson arranged to secure control over the Honeymooners characters himself, ensuring that whatever happened next would be entirely on his terms. Audrey Meadows, for her part, didn't chase another sitcom role after the show wound down. She shifted her focus toward business, eventually becoming one of the earliest women to serve on the board of a major financial institution. Proof that the sharp intelligence she'd brought to Alice Cramden wasn't just a performance. Art Carney, meanwhile, carried Ed Norton's lovable goofiness into a respected film career, eventually winning an Academy Award in the 1970s, even as the role of Norton remained the one audiences would always associate him with most. Glisson wasn't finished with Ralph Cramden. By the mid-1960s, he brought the characters back as part of the Jackie Glisson Show, this time filmed not in New York but in Miami, where favorable production incentives and full creative control gave him exactly the freedom he'd never had during the original run. But freedom didn't automatically recreate the magic. The tight, 30-minute urgency of the original episodes gave way to longer, looser hour-long installments. The gritty, cramped Brooklyn apartment was replaced with brighter, more polished sets that lost the lived-in texture that had made the original so believable. Glisten, Meadows, and Connie were all older now, and while their chemistry hadn't vanished, the explosive, live-wire energy that had defined the classic 39 had mellowed into something calmer and considerably safer. The Miami episodes were taped rather than performed live, which meant retakes and editing were now possible, a trade that removed the very unpredictability that had made the original run feel so alive in the first place. There were flashes of brilliance scattered throughout the revival, moments where the old rhythm briefly reasserted itself. But without the tight, high-stakes pacing of the original format, and without the raw financial desperation that had once made Ralph's schemes feel urgent rather than quaint, the Miami version never quite reached the heights of its predecessor. It was, in the end, a warmer, gentler cousin to something that had once felt genuinely dangerous. For a while, it looked as though the Honeymooners might simply fade into television history as a fondly remembered but short-lived experiment. Then something unexpected happened: reruns. Local stations began filling daytime and late-night schedules with the original black-and-white episodes, free from the pressure of weekly ratings or Nova sponsors. Freed from that pressure, the show found an entirely new audience. Viewers who had missed it the first time around discovered it fresh, and younger audiences who hadn't even been alive in 1955 found themselves drawn to Ralph, Alice, and Norton in syndication. The very qualities that had once made network executives nervous, the cramped apartment, the loud arguments, the characters who were allowed to be genuinely flawed, now felt refreshing against a backdrop of increasingly polished, formulaic sitcoms. What had been risky in 1955 had, by the 1970s, become a defining strength. Even Bang, Zoom, Straight to the Moon, the very line at the center of That Uneasy Night in 1956, transformed over the following decades from an uncomfortable memory into a beloved piece of pop culture shorthand, referenced and parodied across television, film, and even political speeches. Context had simply shifted. Audiences no longer heard it as a threat. They heard it as a relic of a bygone era of television, performed with the urgency of a stage play rather than the safety of a modern, multi-camera sitcom. Television historians and critics have since traced a direct line from The Honeymooners to some of the most influential sitcoms that followed. Archie Bunker's loud, frustrated rants, the kitchen table battles of the Connor family, and even Homer Simpson's lovable ineptitude all carry unmistakable traces of Ralph Cramden's DNA. The show proved that a sitcom didn't need suburban gloss or moral neatness to succeed. It needed honesty, sharp writing, and characters who felt like they might actually live down the block. By 1985, on the show's 30th anniversary, retrospectives and interviews with surviving cast members cemented what reruns had already proven. The Honeymooners wasn't a cautionary tale about a show that flamed out too soon. It was one of the foundational texts of American television comedy, and The Uneasy Night in 1956 that once threatened its survival had become just one more chapter in a much larger, far more enduring story. What began as a single unscripted beat in a live broadcast, real or embellished by decades of retelling, never actually ended Ralph Cramden's story. It became part of it. A show built out of Brooklyn tenements, blacklisted actresses, and one man's determination to turn his own hard upbringing into 30 minutes of honest comedy went on to shape nearly every great sitcom that followed it. If you enjoyed digging into the real story behind one of television's most enduring shows, stick around. There are plenty more forgotten chapters of classic TV history still worth uncovering.